Stop the world!
The question is whether we can, as you say, find a pathway to peace. That's what we are concerned, and how we get around there. It's very clear to me, and it's very difficult. It's a very difficult message to sort of put on the table. But the era of sort of comprehensive peace agreements has sort of come to an end. It's more about the ugly, imperfect peace. But if we can stop the human suffering, if we can end the atrocities, if we can end the mass killings, the ethnic cleansing, I mean, that for me is what is really important.
Welcome back to Stop the World, the ASPI podcast. I'm Olivia Nelson.
And I'm David Rowe.
Today our guest is Comfort Ero. Comfort is CEO and President of the International Crisis Group, an NGO that carries out research and analysis with the aim of preventing and ending wars. And Dave, this is a really fascinating conversation.
Yeah, this conversation didn't really go where we intended, which was great. I had these fairly fluffy abstract questions in mind about the nature of conflict, and instead I found comfort talking concrete realities and best solutions in an imperfect world, and that turned out to be much more interesting.
Comfort has a quite practical and pragmatic approach to things, and her views really come together as the conversation progresses. Clearly some of the conflicts in Africa that don't get the attention that they deserve are high on her agenda. So you end up talking about the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Rwanda, and of course Sudan in some detail, as well as some of the big picture questions about multilateralism and the wider state of the world, including the Trump effect.
Yeah, I found myself thinking I'm really grateful that there are people like this in the world doing the work they do. Because as belligerent as the world feels right now, and as dysfunctional and hopeless as global governance seems, there are organisations like the Crisis Group making a difference and just making things a bit less crap than they would otherwise be.
I couldn't agree more. I really hope people stick with this one because it's well worth a listen. So let's hear from Comfort Ero.
I'm here with Comfort Ero. Comfort, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to try and cover a lot in a short time here, but a good place to start is the paper that you released on the 1st of January this year about 10 conflicts to watch in 2025. I have to say it holds up rather well, but obviously an unstable world delivers surprises. What's your overall take on the first half of this year? Is it better or worse than you were anticipating at the start of the year? And what's surprised you or sticks out as noteworthy?
This is a very good question. I mean, I think the first thing I will say is that the 10 conflicts to watch, which is what you're referring to, it's not a predictive document. It's about what we consider, and there's no science behind it. It's what we consider as Crisis Group, based on our analysts in the field, a constellation of what they think that we should watch throughout the year, and what we want our readership, what we want decision makers, policy makers to focus on throughout the year, partly from a humanitarian crisis position, sort of what are the key conflicts that will pose a significant humanitarian challenge, partly also because of the human suffering behind those conflicts. There's also another category of conflicts where we see potential opportunities, or where we see a deterioration of conflicts as well. So when you look at the list that we've got, it won't surprise you that at the top of the conflict to watch, particularly also because we're writing in the context of Trump coming in, the introduction was partly about how you deal, or how the world comes together that's already disrupted, how it comes together and aligns itself with somebody who's a disruptor, which is Trump. But it also says that given the art of deal making of the man himself, he may come across as providing sort of unorthodox approaches, and his iconoclasm may lend itself to some potential openings that we don't necessarily foresee. Also because he himself has proclaimed that he is against war and he wants to end sort of US foreign adventurism overseas. There's a sense in which those foundational aspects of his own foreign policy led us to the conclusion that we may see some opportunities. So it shouldn't surprise you that right at the top, aside from the good news that Syria was offering, that then we looked straight away at places where we thought that Trump could provide an opening. But at the same time, we said, look, there are places that, for all the reasons that we can discuss, may lend themselves to further deterioration, more mayhem, more chaos, more human suffering, and that we don't quite see those openings yet. But it's worth noting to your readers that the top two conflicts for Crisis Group on the list, one is a good news story at the time, and I mean, the picture's mixed. It's Syria, good in terms of the dramatic transition that you saw with the fall of 30-year brutal regime of Assad, and then also the worst situation that we see is the worst case humanitarian crisis still for this year, Sudan. And then we follow on into what we're watching right now in Middle East. I think the big surprise for us, to go back to your opening question, is what we're watching right now with Iran. I mean, we did not imagine that Trump would provoke or instigate or sort of declare US troops bombing into Iran. So that admittedly was the big shock so far in these last 6 months. And then I think the pace in which Trump has gone ahead with a number of the issues that he said he was going to project has been the stunning pace, I would say. I think we already had a sense around things like USAID and things like that, but it's a pace that I think has been a shock, partly enabled by his former lieutenant of Doge, Elon Musk as well. But he's left, but it doesn't mean that the pace has gone down.
Yeah,
well.
yeah. I mean, I completely agree with you about the surprise with Trump being his willingness to use force in what was a risky situation. I mean, it could have provoked a reckless response from Iran targeting US bases or US personnel around the region, and then the US presumably would have been dragged further into conflict. I mean, there are all sorts of things that Iran could have done that it actually, well, we don't want to obviously declare the problem solved, but so far the reaction from Iran has been relatively restrained, and therefore it's the gamble that Trump took has not produced the worst outcomes. I'm interested in what you say about, I mean, this idea of his disruptive nature creating opportunities, and I completely see the logic of that. Are there any other? I mean, it's hard to see where else it has happened to date. I mean, his approach to Ukraine has been fairly unproductive and has been dismal in its outcomes. Unfortunately, that continues. Certainly, Israel, Gaza, there isn't a lot to look at in terms of bright outcomes that Trump's disruptiveness might have created there. I mean, do you see any other areas where perhaps that disruption might actually create a sort of surprise openings?
I think before I'll come back to sort of the other things that you're hinting of. So if Iran sort of sent shockwaves and concerns about sort of where the US was headed to, especially in the context where Trump said he didn't want to get involved in the forever wars, and where he said he didn't want to see US sort of, well, I wouldn't say troops, but just to see US engagement and to be dragged into a war. I think so. That's the sort of the negative side, and I think it's worth sort of explaining negative because we don't know where it's headed to. I think the other big surprise on the more positive ledger has been in relation to the Great Lakes, and particularly the tensions between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, because we walked into the assumption that Trump's foreign policy would not be interested in engaging with Africa, except for places where we saw some kind of like strategic interest, and for us, strategic interest meant China as well. So I think, if I recall, Somaliland, for example, was the only Africa mention in the Project 2025. So it was very curious for us to see Trump's administration be interested in the Great Lakes, be interested in Rwanda, and be interested in the DRC. And so last week, on the 27th of June, we saw the Rwandese and Congolese foreign ministers sign an agreement under the US mediation, sort of concerning that fight that's been taken on for a long time. I mean, in Eastern DRC, there had been a long going regional effort being led by Angola and being led at one time by Kenya and various forces to deal with sort of the tensions between Kinshasa and Kigali. And suddenly we saw Qatar get engaged, and then later the baton being passed over to the US. And the agreement, just to quickly provide background to your listeners, the agreement recommits both parties, so Rwanda and the DRC, to one, respect the territorial integrity of their neighbors, and then to cease collaboration with armed groups and to resolve sort of the dispute peacefully. You'll recall at the start of this year that the M23, the armed group that has sort of had extensive support from Rwanda, had marched on extensively into Goma, and their demands were not just about the East, but also elements of regime change. Rwanda has claimed since the genocide of 1994 that for national security purposes, it still needed to deal with elements of those who were involved in the genocide. And they often used the east of Congo as a base for their own incursions into the country. So that tussle has been going on for quite some time. There is obviously an economic agenda also there that binds Rwanda, Uganda, and the DRC in a tussle. But it's a surprising development, and there is partly also a minerals dimension, critical minerals being the big buzzword and interest this year in 2025. And I think Felix Tshisekedi looked at what was going on in Ukraine and thought and wondered whether this would be a way in which to get the US interested and engaged to deal with his own security dilemma in the east of the country as well.
Look, my ignorance is embarrassingly on display in real time here. But
Yeah.
I mean, you clearly you are giving credit to the US for brokering that deal. I mean, what do you attribute their enthusiasm there? I mean, is it for a famously America First approach that this administration is taking? Is it the critical minerals dimension, or are there other reasons why they've decided to throw themselves into it?
So, I mean, I think at the core of it is the critical minerals. I don't think we should sort of shy away from that. That is ultimately what is driving Trump's interests. There is no other sort of agenda. I mean, I think what is important is that the agreement between Kinshasa and Kigali is a result of sort of months-long diplomatic process that was initiated in Doha and later steered by the US. So Qatar has a close relationship with Rwanda. Tshisekedi saw that as a potential way in which to engage Qatar. And then there was an effort also then to bring in the US. And I should actually back up and say that the Biden administration had played a critical role during his tenure, and people like Antony Blinken have been very concerned and critical of the role that Rwanda was playing, also vis-a-vis the DRC. So there was a sort of a legacy already there that saw the US engaged. And then we saw at the start of the year, when things were really heating up between Kigali and Kinshasa, we heard Trump acknowledge that this was a serious crisis. But as I said, it was one conflict that we didn't imagine the US would be engaged in. But Tshisekedi, skillfully evoked the critical minerals as a way in which to get America involved. Now, the agreement itself builds on previous agreements and existing frameworks for things that have always been at the heart of the conflict. So regional trade cooperation to diffuse the tensions around resource management and resource competition, especially around minerals. And the US sort of negotiators, I mean, certainly they, in the conversations that they've had with my colleagues, they saw the critical incentive around sort of the minerals as a way of getting both sides involved. And of course, the US is not acting in an altruistic manner here. It sees the minerals investment as a key feature of its engagement as well, even though it sort of de-emphasized its own commercial angle, but it's not acting out of altruistic sort of international sort of rules of law game here. It's purely from an economic incentive for them as well.
And sorry, just one more sort of vibey type question on this before I move on. I mean, as someone who is dedicated to conflict prevention and reduction and the head of an organization that is the same, how do you feel about, I suppose, the pursuit of peace negotiations driven by that narrow economic interest rather than as a global good? I mean, a lot of Ukraine supporters were somewhat outraged by Trump's, minerals deal with Ukraine. Others said, "Well, we've got to be more pragmatic here and just recognise that if it gets them constructively engaged, then that's better for everyone." And of course, Volodymyr Zelensky was the one who reportedly first proposed it. But I mean, do you see a negative global trend if the democratic superpower of the world is pursuing peace deals for that narrow economic gain rather than as a global good?
Look, that's a good question. That's a fair question. And in a sense, we, myself and our executive vice president, we issued a report that sort of looked at Trump's unorthodox approach to peacemaking. And we characterized the effort to end the war between sort of the Rwandan-backed M23 and the Congolese forces. We characterized it as sort of a bracing mix of mercantilism and peacemaking.
So
to answer your question, that as I said, this was not altruistic. This was not for some greater good. I think the question for us, there are two questions: whether it temporarily stops the M23 offensive from sort of pushing on its march towards Kinshasa. So I think that's the one thing. Whether it gets the two presidents, Felix Tshisekedi and Paul Kagame, whether it gets them to end their own fighting and we can get diplomacy and that we can get Tshisekedi to agree to talk to the rebels, something he's previously refused to do. So that's the other big issue as well. So as much as one may want to sort of declare this sort of this is the ugly face of peacemaking, but if it gets us closer to ending what are quite horrific violence being committed in the east of Congo, the human suffering is quite astronomical as well. So, I mean, we're not naive to say that this is going to get us out of the door. And so one of the things that we do say is that it will require significant attention from other key leaders, other key actors. One of the most important key actors and one of the elements of the peace agreement is that the African Union itself steps in to help shore up the agreement. As I said to you, there have been successive agreements in the past. Much of what was signed last week in Washington is based on those previous agreements. There's nothing essentially new in it. What is different is that it's been ushered in by Qatar on one side and also the US, who we didn't think was going to be engaged in this way. So that's what's significant. But the facts, the dynamics, the history behind this conflict is still very much the same. And I think the key question for us now is the follow-up that has to happen to make sure that we deal with also, I think, another reality that we need to grapple with, which has been partly why this conflict has just gone on, is that there are different competing mediators in the room as well. So I mentioned the Americans and Qatar, and they're going to likely hand over because they're not going to want to keep this file for too long. They're going to have to hand over to the African Union and making sure that the African mediation structure, which is ill prepared at the moment and is riven with rivalries, make sure that we manage that to get to a more sustainable peace, because both sides in this conflict will play off the fact that the AU and the competition will as a result undermine the agreement as well.
So you've mentioned Sudan. You've written and spoken about it as well quite a bit in the past. We did a podcast on it ourselves a couple of months ago. It is the world's worst conflict in terms of the numbers of people displaced, driven to hunger and so forth. Depressingly, it has everything in terms of drivers. It's got local sectarian and ethnic tensions. It's got rivalry between two powerful elites. It's got resources that are being fought over or being sought after by, such as gold, critical minerals. There are outside larger states interfering, provision of new technologies, new weapons such as drones, obvious neglect from the international community that's preoccupied with other things. I mean, just if you had a moment to, I suppose, tell our listeners, but imagining that you've got a chance to speak to G7 leaders, for instance, and give a sort of 5-minute take on why this is a crucial conflict for them to pay attention to. What's the case for how we might actually resolve this?
I mean, I think your own opening remarks is the case as well. The headlines suggest that the worst crisis of our time is Gaza and Ukraine, and that these two typify the crisis of our time. But when one goes through the numbers that you've just described, again, you realize that Sudan is sort of the epicenter of the sort of new landscape of conflict that we're dealing with. So it's the world's largest displaced crisis, with over 10 million people displaced internally, and then more than 1 million refugees across into Chad, a very vulnerable, weak country, South Sudan, a country that was only midwifed 10 years ago, Egypt and Ethiopia. All these countries are going through their own crisis internally. The Horn of Africa itself is a sort of a microcosm of all the sort of geopolitics, both regional, both international, that you can imagine as well. It is also a region where a number of key actors, Gulf countries, China, Europe, Russia, are all see themselves as key stakeholders in this region as well. So there is both a strategic interest, there's a humanitarian imperative as well, and there's a real concern that yet another internationalized civil war confronts this region as well. And humanitarian agencies, if you want to even have it in more stark terms, humanitarian agencies will tell you that 25 million people, over more than half the people of the population, are in urgent need of assistance as well. And that we were talking earlier this year and last year that, this is a country that is veering towards famine as well. So all the numbers, all the indicators of a humanitarian tragedy should be the reasons why sort of international attention should grab and should be at the top of mind for everybody as well. At least 15 to 20,000 estimated have been killed. There's limited access to all the key areas, and as I said, it was just 20 years ago that we were talking about genocidal like crimes being committed in Darfur, and fast forward, the same Darfur is now seeing sort of famine conditions, acute food insecurity, aid delivery as well. And the civil infrastructure has collapsed through the many regions of Sudan. 80% of the hospitals in active combat areas are non-functional. So I don't know what other case one needs to make to get world attention, focus on urban warfare, on the ruinous nature of Sudan. And the conflict is not just in Sudan anymore, but it's sucking in the region as well.
It's a remarkable insight that you just certainly gave to me. I mean, this idea of the epicenter of a new landscape of conflict, it feels to me like what you're describing there is, so many of the world's problems actually sort of coalescing around one country and as conflict there. I mean, you talk about, I suppose geopolitical trends. Perhaps in the 1990s, in the post-Cold War period, we were talking for a while about the world coming together to solve conflicts. It almost feels as though you're describing there the world coming together to ruin a country through, each country sort of pursuing its own interests without any sense of sort of global responsibility for conflict reduction or resolution. Is it that depressing?
It is that depressing. I mean, to add even more sort of texture and complexity to what you've said, it's also the battleground for middle power contests as well. So why I describe it as sort of the epicenter as well is that the war itself has become a flashpoint for sort of intensifying regional competition among what we call middle powers. And those middle powers, it's Egypt, it's Saudi Arabia, it's the UAE, it's Turkey, each of them seeking to shape the conflict's outcome to fit their own strategic interests. So it's less about Sudan. And we said earlier this year that if you took all of these external interests out, the path towards getting close to resolution will not necessarily be perfect, will not necessarily end easily, but that complex nature of external interference, take that away, and it may allow us to see some openings to end the fighting as well. So, but it's harder now because while Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Turkey all back, for example, the Sudanese armed forces, their agendas do diverge. You've got Egypt is focused on Nile water security, sort of preventing state fragmentation. Saudi Arabia having shifted from sort of being sort of mediator to advocate, now champions the Sudanese armed forces. You've got recognition as a legitimate state, and then you've got Turkey is driven by its own sort of commercial ideological interests. And then on the other side of the ledger, you've got the sort of the United Arab Emirates, by contrast, has emerged over time as a sort of the backer, assertive backer of the rapid support force, the coup-proofer, the paramilitary that was created by the former Assad regime of Bashir, also allegedly now supplying the RSF with arms and drones. So, the survival of the belligerents of this crisis is partly because of their external backers as well. So we need to find a way in which to deal with those competing interests on the outside that give life to the war internally, and then we've got to start thinking about, because it's about power between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support force. It's about power. It's about who gets control of Khartoum. It's about who controls the resources. Now, if you can take the external dimension out of it, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but it at least will enable us to begin to think about de-escalation and dealing with the humanitarian crisis in the country as well.
Do you worry that Sudan is an early, I guess, indication of what may become a broader global trend, where you have multiple powers reaching into other countries and contributing to conflict, whether it's a desperate battle for resources, which critical minerals are obviously a hugely important resource for all sorts of technologies. The reach of other countries is greater. There's something like the supply of drones and some basic ISR. I mean, this is sort of the new AK-47s of the 2020s and beyond. Are you worried that this might be a new global trend that we might see elsewhere?
No. I mean, you're right. In fact, you're speaking directly in line with an article, again, another one that authored with our executive vice president, Richard Atwood. And as you were speaking, it reminded me of the article that we wrote back in 2023, that Sudan itself, today, the title of that piece was called Sudan and the New Age of Conflict, and how regional power politics were fueling deadly war. So there is a Sudanese dimension to this. I don't want to I don't want to say that there isn't, and there was a transition. There was hope back in 2019, where all of us spoke about a revolutionary moment, a young, dynamic movement across the society of Sudan that has sort of propelled optimism in the country. But that sort of reversed itself because the competition and the tussle for power between these two forces, the army and then the paramilitary army, sort of cut short that inspiring revolution, choked it to its core, prevented and obstructed Sudan's democratic transition, and but also, as I said, because of the various security, commercial interests of other players, there were signs already that the effort to sort of put together a viable peace in Sudan was also going to be hijacked, not only by that internal power competition, but also by the interests of others outside as well. So, in a sense, the entanglement that we're seeing in Sudan today, to go to what you said, is symptomatic of the larger shifts in global power as well. Is symptomatic of the sort of jockeying for influence in unstable arenas. Is symptomatic of the sort of the dynamics that help to fuel the deadliest wars that we're seeing, and it's also symptomatic of the kind of weaponry that is used. And we saw how drones, for example, were ultimate game changers in Ethiopia's war. We saw how there were ultimate game changers in other crises as well. And we've seen also, because 20 years ago, Sudan was under the purview, in terms of managing the crisis, Sudan was under the purview of the United States. Governments around the world, they tucked themselves behind the United States as a lone hegemon, driving through and bringing stability to a number of these regions. Well, one of the consequences, I think, today is that, many sense of vacuum of influence. It's a real tussle now. And you're seeing sort of crises like Sudan become proxies for other interests and for other rivals to advance their own interests in a place like Sudan as well.
It's a bit of a wearying cliche to talk about the collapse of the rules-based order, but I mean, to what extent is what you are talking about here reflective of that collapse and I suppose the constraining effect that the rules-based order had on middle powers, on global conflict around the world? I mean, how much do you attribute to that?
Look, it's a question that's on everybody's mind. I mean, more and more people talk less about rules-based international order and talk about sort of international law. And we're seeing the obvious way in which that is being undermined quite glaringly. I mean, we can talk about Sudan, but you're looking at it also in the context of Russia's own invasion into Ukraine, where the principle of non-aggression has been violated as well. So it's not on the altar of Sudan alone that you've seen sort of the principles that should govern states, especially around sort of humanitarian principles and Geneva Convention. It didn't start and it won't end in Sudan, but Sudan is also a reminder that the guardrails that would often curtail or constrain leaders from excessive use of force are no longer viable, that it's very hard now in a situation where you see sort of things, when you look at developments in Myanmar, for example, where the junta is pretty sort of entrenched and where it's used the most vicious type of tactics, where in Nagorno-Karabakh there was nobody to restrain the takeover there, where you're seeing gangs use the most heinous forms of atrocities to control Haiti and the Sahel. And you can go on, and nobody's able to hold any of these leaders into check. And there's a sense in which you can get away with it. You can get away with undermining the core tenets and standards of international law because every other leader is watching other leaders get away with the rules that govern aggression. And you're seeing others trying to sort of redraw borders by force. You're seeing the sort of nuclear non-proliferation architecture being undermined. You're seeing the norms against masculine and ethnic cleansing. For example, everywhere you turn, you're seeing these mass assaults. So it's no wonder that the leaders in somewhere like Sudan or elsewhere feel that they can get away with that because there's nobody able to constrain them. And we're in this world where the rules themselves have been shattered, they've been undermined. It's a very messy world. It's a world where I think, to go back to our 10 conflicts to watch that you mentioned at the top of the conversation, we did say that this was going to be the year of lawlessness. And we're seeing it right in front of our faces in practically every conflict that we're watching, this ability to ride over the rules, the principles that would govern states at a time of war as well.
We're going to go over time, but there are two more things that I do desperately need to ask you, and hopefully they will put us on a trajectory where we can finish feeling a little inspired, that we can all find a way to contribute. I mean, the first is just tell me about, in your time leading the crisis group and elsewhere, I mean, what have you seen are the most effective pillars of conflict resolution? How do you think those are changing in this sort of, this year of lawlessness that we're talking about? And what is what's the pathway for some sort of, global resolution mechanism, in the absence of a sort of functioning, multilateral kind of, body who can really help in the way that we hoped it might have 30 or 40 years ago?
Yeah, look, let me say one thing, and I really do want to emphasize it, because that sometimes we focus heavily on all that is wrong, that we sometimes miss some of the openings that we see or the potential path. And so we deliberately started with Syria in the 10 conflicts to watch, because we saw all the opportunities there for all the challenges that Syria is facing, which we acknowledged when we were writing the 10 conflicts. We did say it was an important good news because we saw that one of the world's sort of bloodiest conflicts was sort of coming to an end as well. Now, a lot could go wrong, and we acknowledge that as well. And I think also the work, the effort that went into getting Trump to call an end to the sanctions for Syria. Now, it's going to be complicated because there is no magic wand that you can wave to sort of lift all the sanctions. But his articulation of that when he was in Riyadh was quite significant as well. So I don't think we should lose sight of what that means for Syrians who know themselves that there's a lot of danger around them in terms of dealing with just the multitude of sort of disorder in the country. We're already seeing it, the tensions in the country as well. So I think we should keep that sort of at the top of the mind, that there are things that international actors can do to enable the process to continue on its path, even though we know that there are a number of sort of challenges that will confront the country as well. So I just want to say that as well. There are other sort of areas where, for all the false dawns and false starts that we see, whether it's in Colombia, whether it's in even in Haiti, whether it's in the tensions that are looming in Bangladesh and even in Afghanistan, the anxiety is acute, and yet there are sort of little glimmers and opportunities. And I think the key for us is to make sure the door remains open when we see those opportunities. Even if it's going to be difficult, sometimes the door is firmly shut, and sometimes it gets open. And it's how to make sure you keep those doors open throughout the way. And the other issue that I think is worth noting, because I said to you already that at the start, there are certain things that we didn't imagine that we would see. And as we speak, by the way, the question of a ceasefire for Gaza is back on the table, subject to the agreement of Hamas accepting it, and also of Israel, which undermined it back in March, the one that Trump put together. Credit to President Trump for pushing it through. Now it's to get it back onto the table and ensures that it sticks as well. So there are openings. The key is whether we can keep the door open long enough to end all the suffering that we're seeing as well. So, there are troubles on the horizon, but at the same time, there are some places where we can see some openings as well. And we didn't mention it, but you mentioned it in passing with Ukraine. I mean, it's going to be a tough, difficult summer, but we've also seen some important diplomacy take place. And I think Trump has shown his frustration with Putin. Whether it's going to alter the reality on the ground in Ukraine is still the unknown question. But nonetheless, diplomacy has been crucial also in that particular crisis.
So the message is that we have to hope that people of goodwill will find creative and imaginative solutions to crises and conflicts case by case, rather than sort of hope for some sort of overarching formula or mechanism. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, that's one way. And I just think that in this era of transactionalism, and it didn't start with Trump and it wouldn't end with him, and where multilateralism as well is sort of in the doghouse and it's not performing in the way, there has to be other ways. And in the end, a leader having interest, a leader being transactional, that's not for me the key. The question is whether we can, as you say, find a pathway to peace. That's what we are concerned, and how we get around there. It's very clear to me, and it's very difficult. It's a very difficult message to sort of put on the table. But the era of sort of comprehensive peace agreements has sort of come to an end. It's more about the ugly, imperfect peace. But if we can stop the human suffering, if we can end the atrocities, if we can end the mass killings, the ethnic cleansing, I mean, that for me is what is really important. The politics of getting it to stick, that's also going to be the conundrum in this very difficult moment of sort of peacemaking and diplomacy as well. But this for me is the heart of the matter. It's an ugly path to peace, but we have to get there because of just the sheer scale of human suffering that's around us as well.
Comfort. Look, I hope everyone takes that on board. I suppose I feel wiser, perhaps a bit more realistic, but I think you've left me there on a note of positivity that despite the sometimes depressing picture that we see around us, the task ahead of us is to press on, find solutions wherever we can, however imperfect they are, and stop what is some like almost unfathomably appalling bloodshed going on around the world right now.
Exactly. And I think a degree of pragmatism.
Sure. But
also you're dealing with the political realities as it is. It's not an acceptance of those realities, but it's how you work with those realities, I think is the core to get into a viable peace that deals with those atrocities as well.
All right. Comfort, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening, folks. We'll be back next week.